So thank you everybody for being here. My name is Gabby Elvira, and I'm the program coordinator for Pacific Environment. And I'm really pleased to welcome everyone to our panel discussion where we'll be having a conversation on LNG and other methane-based fuels. So for those of you who don't know, Pacific Environment is an environmental nonprofit. We confront our most urgent environmental issues by connecting local and global movements, catalyzing policy change, and inspiring action for the benefit of people and our planet. We are committed to getting ships off of fossil fuels as soon as possible and advocating at the local, state, and international level for policies and actions that promote a decarbonized global shipping sector. We have consultative status with the International Maritime Organization, and our Ports for People campaign is our ports policy advocacy campaign, which seeks to transform ports from hotspots of fossil fuels to thriving hubs of sustainable economic development and environmental protection. I want to introduce you all to the panelists taking part in this discussion, so I'll first pass it off to Anna.
Thank you, Gabby. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. My name's Anna Barford. You can use she, her pronouns for me. And I'm the Oceans Campaigner at Stand.earth. I've been with Stand for just over 6 years now. I'm in Vancouver, BC, unceded Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. And I was born here. So I have, through generations of family, we have watched the port expand and watch more ships, bigger ships, come to this region and have a notion of what it means to be residents with lungs next to an expanding port and the air pollution that comes with it. And I am deeply concerned about what LNG means for residents all around our planet with lungs, as well as our atmosphere. So thank you so much for having me. Back to you, Gabby.
Thank you, Anna. Enzo, go ahead.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me speak. I'm Enzo Kramers. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a researcher here representing Maritime Beyond Methane, MARBEM. Uh, Maritime Beyond Methane is an initiative to accelerate the shipping industry's transition beyond methane-based fuels by equipping policymakers, financiers, and industry leaders with evidence-based decision-making. Once again, thank you all for being here.
Great. And Stacy, go ahead.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Stacey Oakes. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a community organizer with 350 Tacoma, which works on climate justice, stewardship, and building community locally. And I'm also a member of Seattle Cruise Control Steering Committee. I've been part of working on LNG since 2017 through the Indigenous-led resistance against Puget Sound Energy's Tacoma LNG fracked gas refinery since 2017.
Great. Thank you all. And also just to mention, we also have Fern here, who's kind of on standby for tech support. Fern also works with me at Pacific Environment. Fern, I don't know if you want to say anything. You're muted, Fern.
Thank you for everyone who's attending. Yeah, that's it really. Let's kick it off.
Great. Thanks, everybody. So just to run through some housekeeping items and to lay some context for why we're having this conversation. Just as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and we'll share the recording afterwards. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the webinar, but as our panelists are speaking, please feel free to drop any questions you have into the Q&A box and we'll try to respond to them. So that's also a reminder for all of the panelists. You can respond to any of the questions that you see pop up into the Q&A box as the webinar is happening. So today we'll be talking about LNG and other methane-based fuels, specifically methane derived from organic sources called bio-LNG, biomethane, or RNG, and methane derived from electricity, water, and carbon dioxide called e-methane or e-LNG. So why are we talking about methane-based fuels today? Well, in response to the climate crisis, the shipping industry is in transition to reduce and eventually eliminate its greenhouse gas emissions. This transition requires a switch to zero or near zero emission fuels. Uptake of the technology and infrastructure to support this transition is largely being driven by regulations at the regional and global level. Most notably, the International Maritime Organization, or IMO, approved a draft net zero framework which will set a global fuel standard that requires ships to gradually reduce the carbon intensity of its fuel over time. Though yet to be formally adopted, ship owners, ports, fuel producers, and other actors along the fuel supply chain are actively preparing for shipping's transition to the fuels that will meet these global regulations. In Washington, stakeholders from all different sectors are working to deploy affordable, sustainable maritime fuels through initiatives like the Sustainable Maritime Fuels Collaborative. Ports have also been taking a leading role in gathering stakeholders to talk about sustainable marine fuels and communicate about new fueling projects happening in and around the port. Pacific Environment has convened this panel as part of this ongoing dialogue around sustainable maritime fuels. LNG and other methane-based fuels have ballooned in the conversation around the future of maritime shipping, both locally in the Pacific Northwest and globally. And we've invited these panelists here today to share their perspectives on these fuels and ensure our evaluation and planning for future maritime fuels is nuanced, comprehensive, and includes community voices and concerns. So with that, I'll pass it off to Anna to give us an overview of LNG and where it comes from. And let me pull up the presentation.
Thank you so much, Gabby. While you're pulling up the slides, I'll talk a little bit, which is to say LNG does not spring out of the ground as LNG. The NG is natural gas, um, which we understand to be primarily made up of methane. There we go. Methane gas. Methane is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas. It is more than 80 times more powerful at warming the atmosphere over the 20-year time frame than carbon dioxide. Methane gas is also critically a precursor to ground level ozone, which is a pollutant that we know harms humans. We also know is detrimental to vegetation. So this is a threat to agriculture and crops, as well as wild fauna and flora. The L is for liquefied, so this is cooled for size. That is minus 160 degrees Celsius or minus 250 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is quite an energy intensive process. That's a big temperature difference from ambient. Of course, we do this for size. It squeezes to about 600 times smaller in liquid form. Methane gas itself is too voluminous to be commercially viable to really store very well, or to ship across seas, or to use in terms of energy density for maritime use, especially in the context of transoceanic shipping. And cooling, gasification, and liquefaction need to be tightly controlled processes. There are contaminants that come off, and this is part of where a lot of pollutants come off is in these processes. Now, in the context of maritime shipping around the Salish Sea, LNG comes from Seaspan and Fortis. So Seaspan are operating three kind of mini tankers for bunkering that fill up from the Tilbury LNG plant that is their direct neighbors to the Seaspan facility. So the Tilbury LNG plant is operated by Fortis. They have an export license for 2.5 million tons per year annually for a plant that they are applying to increase to 3.5 million tons per year of liquefaction capability. And so for those following LNG on the West Coast, this is a similar export size to wood fiber and cedar as they are approved now. Fortis does not drill the gas themselves. They buy it from gas wells. And then the context of British Columbia that is often touted as a very green source of LNG, of natural gas, it's important to remember that those wells are fracking. This is unconventional fossil fuels. The resources that we have for the future are from the Montney Play. This particular deposit of gas cannot be extracted via conventional methods. They require unconventional methods, commonly known as fracking. So the pie chart on the right, figure 5 from the BC Oil and Gas Commission, is about production by source. The overwhelming majority came from the Montney Play. And in terms of reserves by source, figure 4, for the future, it is going to be the Montney Play. So gas coming out of BC will be from fracking overwhelmingly. And you can see that this is a trend that's continued over time. So we had conventional reserves, but over the last decade, couple decades, we've seen that the conventional reserves have been well overtaken by unconventional reserves. And if we have not passed already, 90% of the gas that's coming out of BC is from fracking. What does fracking look like on the ground? Several of my colleagues travel to the Peace Valley region regularly, and this is what a fracking rig looks like. They're big, they're tall, they have lots of warning signs all around them. Because they come with smokestacks burning, sometimes very black smoke. This is not safe for communities around, as well as leakages of methane, as well as toxic gases, and sulfur-based. BC also allows fracking to frack with fresh water. So the process in unconventional wells is to create a mixture at high temperatures and high pressures of water to blast down into shale rock to knock the gas out. And a lot of that chemical mixture is proprietary, so we don't know all of the things that are in there. And particularly some of the older tailings ponds. And we do not require or cannot require treatment. So these are tailings ponds, these are water being held that are unlikely to ever return to the water cycle. We in Vancouver are under stage 3 drinking water restrictions at this stage, and fracking exists in a region that has been under a drought for quite some time. So we don't have a lot of water to spare around, and a lot is going to the oil and gas industry. We're talking billions of liters every year if they are allowed to continue in this way, if we don't do something about it, particularly if the LNG industry expands even through maritime use.
Thank you, Anna. Um, I'm now going to pass it over to Enzo. We've heard from many stakeholders in Washington. There seems to be an agreement that we do need to transition away from LNG to more climate-friendly alternatives. And in these conversations, we've heard that RNG and e-methane come up as these proposed longer-term fuels that can use the same infrastructure as LNG. So, Enzo, I'll turn it over to you to break down what are these methane-based fuel alternatives?
Thank you, Gabby. Thanks, Anna, for the overview of LNG. So, in comparison, I will be talking about RNG, renewable natural gas, and e-methane, which are touted as two potential future pathways to decarbonize the LNG sector. Sorry, apologies for that. So I'll start with RNG, renewable natural gas. It has other common names. You might hear it as biomethane or bio-LNG. What it is methane from organic sources. So this is any organic matter that releases methane automatically through some organic process, which is then captured, then has to be upgraded and liquefied for use in LNG systems. What does that mean? Well, the methane that comes out of biogenic sources is often only 60 to 70% methane, contains a lot of other compounds, particularly carbon dioxide, nitrogen, oxygen, other sulfides, ammonia. And the refining process requires bringing that up to 90 to 95% methane so that it is compatible with use in existing LNG systems. This still means that RNG is 5 to 10% carbon dioxide, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfides, and ammonia. The sources of renewable natural gas, organic matter, commonly are large-scale manure and wastewater holding facilities, and agricultural or forestry residues. The risks, I will go into this later, but a brief overview. The risks include greenhouse gas effects of supply chain leakage, tailpipe emissions, onboard slip, safety risks. Renewable natural gas suffers from scalability limits, particularly for the shipping sector. Livestock farming is associated with land use change, water use, and local emissions, as well as RNG contributing to lock-in and perverse agricultural or waste incentives. E-methane is also known as e-LNG, synthetic LNG, or renewable synthetic natural gas. It's methane that is made from combining hydrogen and carbon dioxide, and then liquefied for use in LNG systems. Because of this, it is almost 100% methane. Now, where does the carbon dioxide or the hydrogen come from? Carbon dioxide comes from some carbon capture often, usually point source capture, which is capturing from a polluting process, or hydrogen from electrolysis. I'll talk about the emissions implications of these later. And of course, the risks, it similarly has the same risks, greenhouse gas risks to all methane-based fuels, supply chain leakage, tailpipe emissions, onboard slip, safety risks. The energy requirements to make e-methane are significant and brings into question cost competitiveness of e-methane in the long run, as well as having unclear maturity, as well as contributing to lock-in effects and perverse incentives on the fossil industry.
Great. Thank you to both Anna and Enzo for giving us the lay of the land of where LNG and these other methane-based fuels come from and how they're made. Now that we have that understanding, we want to dive into some of their impacts. Enzo, I know you already started talking about this, so we'll stay with you to talk about some of these risks.
All right, thank you for having me back so soon. I'm going to talk about the risks of LNG and all methane-based fuels. So I'll want to start with a brief refresher on the science behind methane and its climate impact. Methane is a highly potent greenhouse gas. It's 82.5 times more impactful than carbon dioxide over a 20-year lifespan. Since the Industrial Revolution, methane has caused 30% of human-induced global warming, right behind carbon dioxide. Now, according to the experts at the United Nations Environmental Program, it is clear that the, quote, fastest, most cost-effective way to slow near-term warming is to cut methane emissions. However, this news hasn't reached the shipping sector. Methane emissions from LNG-fueled ships increased 180% between 2016 and 2023, more than any other greenhouse gas, and shows no sign of slowing down. The cost to society of those methane emissions alone in 2023 from just the shipping sector was 946 million US dollars. Now, I included this last point as a little bit of a background, the context that we are in. Last year, the UN Secretary General said that achieving the Paris climate target of 1.5 degrees is overshooting the Paris climate target of 1.5 degrees is inevitable. So the fundamental problem with methane is that it leaks throughout the supply chain of any methane-based fuel. Now, methane leakage starts during fossil LNG extraction. As Anna said, recently explained, where recent independent aerial measurements of US and Canada LNG extraction, read fracking, shows methane emissions rates orders of magnitude higher than reported in inventories. RNG similarly leaks methane at production sites, estimated at 5% for agricultural facilities and 8% for wastewater facilities. Further down the supply chain, liquefaction facilities have been observed to leak methane. Even pipeline transport is associated with methane emissions at compressor stations and through pipeline leaks, whilst LNG tanker transport by ship releases methane. I'm going to point here to an ongoing campaign by the research organization ICCT, which is aiming to quantify methane emissions from LNG tankers. And lastly, the LNG bunkering process has been observed to release methane. And whilst the continuous production of boil-off gas in many LNG fuel tank designs, which must be used in auxiliary engines to avoid flaring, which is prohibited, means that many vessels will be incompatible with shore power. While proponents tout ever-decreasing methane slip rates, real-world independent measurements, even of newly deployed vessels, show significant methane slip emissions, and this is particularly near port facilities. The image on the left here was taken by a group of researchers who jumped in a small boat in the port of Rotterdam and using a handheld sensor detected methane plumes from LNG-powered vessels, even from what is pictured here, a modern new build. According to the ICCT fumes study, which independently measured methane slip on ships, they measured LNG slip rates of 6.4% for low-pressure four-stroke engines, the most common type of LNG marine engine deployed to date. With all engines sampled at slip rates between 0.8 and 13%, and in many cases significantly higher than manufacturer-reported values. This issue is particularly prevalent at ports, where frequent low load and maneuvering operations are associated with much higher slip rates, and in some cases by an order of magnitude. Unfortunately, there is no simple technological fix for methane slip. Engine optimization yields limited methane reductions and has NOx emissions trade-offs, whilst higher impact options, such as catalysts and direct gas injection, are still lacking and face deployment and cost barriers. So taking methane leakage and slip into account, the climate benefit of methane-based fuels relative to their counterparts is called into question. Here on this slide, I present some well-to-tank emissions factors for methane-based fuels that better capture observed methane emissions rates. Well-to-tank emissions factors here is all the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, that are associated with the delivery of fuel all the way from the extraction from the ground up to the point where it is inside the tank of the ship. So this does not include any tailpipe or actual burning emissions. So there's an important caveat to these numbers that even these studies likely underestimate methane leakage. So a literature review of Canadian fossil LNG production for shipping found that emissions were 28.6 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule of fuel, more than 50% higher than reported at the IMO. For renewable natural gas from manure via anaerobic digestion, emissions factors vary significantly, depending on assumptions about baseline methane emissions and capture rates. But here there are two representative factors, 11.3 at a very low end and 30.1 grams per megajoule at the high end. Shows that in some cases, RNG can be more polluting than its fossil counterpart. Lastly, for e-LNG using point source CO2 capture, a representative emissions factor is around 7.6 grams per megajoule. These factors may differ significantly from those offered by other sources, which we believe are significant underestimates. These studies particularly overlook major outlier upstream methane leakage sources, and these can contribute the majority of observed emissions and other factors. On fossil LNG, the IEA, International Energy Agency, is very clear. There is absolutely no sign that methane emissions from fossil fuel operations are falling. For renewable natural gas and e-LNG, you may have seen negative emissions factors being quoted. This relies on, so to speak, claiming the emissions reductions that occur elsewhere, so-called double counting, where the agricultural sector, fuel sector, and shipping sector all get to claim the same benefits from single emissions reductions. Factor also depends on assumptions around baseline emissions and additionality. That is, what would have happened if otherwise the RNG was not sold to the shipping sector. Emissions factors have a very strict limitation in that they only capture the direct greenhouse gas emissions impacts. However, methane-based fuels bring a wide array of non-greenhouse gas risks. So first, I'll start with human health and safety risks. Communities and workers near LNG extraction, processing, storage sites, as well as those located near LNG-fueled ships, have had documented exposure to nitrous oxides, sulfur oxides, particulate matter, and volatile organic compounds. Communities near LNG facilities have higher rates of respiratory and cardiovascular disease, neurological damage, and cancer risks. In total, direct air pollution from US LNG export terminals alone contributes up to 60 premature deaths and 957 million in annual health costs. Contrary to industry claims of improved safety, The LNG industry has had a long and continued history of accidents. Again, neighboring communities are the ones left facing the burden of damage, air pollution, and accidents. In a landmark LNG industry accident, in 2004, the Algerian Skidida LNG plant suffered a catastrophic incident that claimed 27 lives. Poor maintenance, inadequate emergency preparedness, and a poor safety culture contributed to the disaster. The reasons are not isolated to this incident nor this time period. Some of the deficiencies identified in 2004 accident persist in subsequent accidents. For a recent port-specific example, in 2004, the Freeport LNG export terminal, Texas, experienced an explosion and a fire of LNG vapors. Though no injuries were reported, damage to the facility required extensive offline maintenance. Washington itself is no stranger to LNG accidents. In 2014, an explosion and fire occurred at an LNG vaporization plant on the Washington-Oregon border, injuring 4 workers. Flames of black smoke forced the evacuation of 300 nearby residents. And lastly, in 2023, a worker was killed and another one was injured during an LNG delivery fire in Toppenish, in which the facility owner was found liable. These accidents paint a picture of the truths of LNG. It is just as risky, if not more, than any other fossil fuel. For RNG specifically, we can categorize its impacts into environmental, community, and agricultural issues. At the risk of sounding like a broken clock here, methane leakage is a big problem. And facilities such as anaerobic digesters, which turn cattle manure into RNG, leak methane at far greater rates than in fossil fuel supply chains. At the same time, the gas produced usually does not contain enough methane to work in LNG systems, and therefore requires upgrading. Process which generates waste and uses energy. On the community side, communities near manure biogas facilities have been observed to have increased concentrations of ammonia, nitrous oxide, volatile organic compounds, and hydrogen sulfides in the air and water, with measurable human health impacts. At the same time, the transport and liquefaction realities of RNG, which I will cover shortly, make RNG much more suited to local community uses. Lastly, on the agricultural side, RNG provides perverse incentives to livestock farmers. Biogas systems are only viable at larger scales, and so RNG production has been documented to spur herd consolidation and farm expansion across the US. In addition, biogas systems are built around so-called manure lagoons, essentially large open pits where manure is just dumped. Farmers could instead shift to more sustainable manure management practices and dramatically reduce methane emissions. And the impacts of livestock agriculture, particularly cattle agriculture, are well known, including direct and indirect land use change, competition for water resources and feed markets, and of course, increased local emissions. Besides sustainability questions, the deployability of RNG is limited by its lack of scalability. For illustration, on the left, I've plotted projections of sustainable RNG supply in 2030 across sustainable feedstocks. These projections are coming from pro-industry sources across the US and Canada. Now, compared to projected demand for natural gas from inshore and from shipping demand, for Canada or for the US individually, shows just how little sustainable RNG supply there is. And this is a consistent finding across literature. RNG cannot scale to meet shipping's demand. These projections also rely on the contribution of dispersed small to medium scale facilities, which are located in cities and farms, often far from bunkering hubs. The production volumes of these facilities are generally quite low, and given methane leakage, venting, and energy requirements, it doesn't even make environmental or economic sense to use it in the shipping sector. Another complicating factor, most RNG comes from what are waste-based feedstocks. Universally, climate mitigation pathways include very specific waste reduction goals, as well as goals for decreasing meat consumption, both of which create tensions and limit future RNG feedstock supply. Now here I'll briefly give an overview of the limits of e-methane as a potential solution. The ICCT ran some modeling and found that if all ships globally were to switch to e-LNG by 2030, total CO2 equivalent emissions would actually increase on a 20-year basis. Methane emissions would double in that scenario. And this is particularly due to supply chain and onboard leakage. Most importantly, the carbon neutrality of e-LNG requires that carbon dioxide used to make e-LNG comes from the atmosphere, in effect closing the carbon cycle when that LNG is taken from the atmosphere, burned, and then returned to the atmosphere. However, the Energy Agency has stated that direct air capture, which is what is necessary to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, is, quote, unlikely to meaningfully scale by 2050. Instead, e-LNG is likely to depend on capturing carbon dioxide from polluting processes. This merely delays the emission of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, meaning that the fuel still creates net emissions, and also making e-LNG a key supporter of fossil-intensive sectors. Other limitations to e-LNG include debunked claims that clean energy will be used to power e-fuel projects, significantly increased fuel costs, enormous energy requirements, where only 14 to 17% of input energy is actually converted into propulsion, and that compared to other marine e-fuels and other emissions reductions technologies, such as wind power, for example, e-LNG remains undemonstrated. Lastly, I want to briefly discuss how RNG and e-LNG extends fossil fuel lock-in rather than enabling the transition. Now, on the surface level, RNG and e-LNG reinforce current investments into fossil LNG, which of course creates financial incentive to continue fossil LNG use. However, limited RNG supply mean that narratives of RNG displacing fossil LNG are not likely to come true. And at the same time, cost and availability means that e-LNG is also unlikely to displace fossil LNG and RNG. Therefore, renewable natural gas and e-LNG are used to justify LNG expansion whilst delaying investment into scalable, sustainable shipping fuels. To put a number on it, continued investment in LNG infrastructure today risks $850 billion in stranded LNG assets by 2030. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand it back to you, Gabby.
Thank you, Enzo. Um, so in our discussion of impacts so far, we've mostly focused on a higher level. So now I want to turn to Anna and Stacy to discuss uh, the local impacts and the risks that this infrastructure, the fuel in their associated infrastructure poses to the places where they live and work. So I'll pass it off to you to kick us off on that discussion, Anna.
Thank you, Gabby. There is a question for Enzo to address about the compatibility with shore power. So I wondered if we wanted to handle that while his great presentation is fresh in all of our minds, or if we should save all questions until the end.
Yeah, let's do it. And I'm sorry if I sort of missed that. And yeah, but Enzo, are you able to address that? I can also talk to the shore power regulation part as well. But maybe the first part of if you could elaborate on whether some of these vessels being incompatible with shore power.
I'm sorry, I'm not able to see the question right now. Can you
Yeah.
quickly?
Yeah, and this is from Logan Danzig. Could you elaborate on some of these vessels being incompatible with shore power? Would this essentially exempt them from any local policies on shore power use, or would they eventually be prevented from using terminals if they require shore power use?
Thank you for that question. This is less of a policy and more of a technology constraint, actually. This is for some fuel tank designs, LNG is stored at a very cold temperature, and to keep it compressed and cool, a certain amount needs to continuously be vented to the atmosphere to keep the pressure stable in the tank. And so some of these older tank designs have this inevitable boil-off gas, which is just gas that is being vented to the atmosphere. And a lot of places either prevent this or don't allow simple venting. So what they alternatively can do is use that excess gas to power their generator engines or their main engines when traveling. But that means that these ships, when they're sitting in ports, inevitably are producing gas that they have to use to power something. So they often will run their generators. And so, regardless of whether or not you provide them shore power, it makes more sense for them to continue running their onshore generators. So it's less of a policy issue. I can't speak to the specific of what regulations would require. I'm sure maybe someone else on this panel could speak better to that. But this is more a design thing of old LNG carriers.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Enzo, and great question, Logan. I'm actually not sure that I have the regulatory answer either because it would probably have to be considered during the rulemaking. Um, but based on what Enzo said, it's really kind of, you know, even if they can plug into shore power, they'd still be emitting, having to run on the LNG fueled engine as well. And maybe I'll just chime in to say that folks, please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A chat box at any time. Thanks.
Thank you so much, folks. I wanted to make sure that we got the answer to that while Enzo's presentation was fresh in our mind. So, Gabby, if it's all right, I'll start talking. Wonderful. Tilbury LNG expansion. This is Tilbury is an island in the south arm of the Fraser within the city of Delta, nestled inside Metro Vancouver. This is a picture that I took of the historic tank and the tank in operation from the riverside of the process. And we're going to talk a little bit about what this site means because if you squint a little at the picture, you can see that Fortis has been advertising on their site literally about Marine Jetty and has pictures of ocean-going vessels all over. So they are tying their next expansion or their expansion that they're applying for to this maritime notion. Let's see, advancing slides. There we go. So this is a picture of facing the other direction. I gave of a walking tour to some very concerned local residents. And behind us, or sort of facing to my left, and you've seen that I've cropped the picture expertly so that you cannot tell how short or tall I am. You can see the south arm of the Fraser River, and this is a very important salmon-bearing stream. You can also see sort of through the bushes, Seaspan short sea shipping. Docks, and I believe some of their vessels are in there ready to have cargo loaded onto them. And you can just on the other bank see tanks from the airport's fuel storage. So this is an area where there is increasing industrialization pressure on an important salmon-bearing stream. If the expansion goes ahead and the marine jetty gets constructed, this is not really an area that we're going to be able to access safely probably anymore. So there's lots of habitat and wildlife in this along these riverbanks. Uh, so Fortis is applying for a phase 2 expansion. What does that mean and why is it relevant to maritime LNG? Because they already have their marine jetty approved. The phase 2 expansion will include a couple of things. So first of all, it's important to remember this is an LNG expansion nestled within an urban center. So this isn't Kitimat, though there is an important community there. We're not in the middle of the wilderness. All of the impacts that come with a gas plant are going to be felt in incredibly populated areas and over some traffic pinch points where I have lost hours of my life, probably coming up to weeks trying to get through tunnels. What they're applying for is to add an incredibly large storage tank. So the one operating right now is 46,000 meters cube. The new tank will be over 140 thousand meters cubed, so more than tripling. This is not a one-to-one expansion. This is not just replacing the very old tank from the 1970s. This is dreams of gas expanding at a time. It's notable when residential use of gas is going down. So our local grid for homes, the demand for gas, we're getting more efficient, we're using less of it. Most of this expansion would be for industrial uses like maritime shipping. Liquefaction will be added as part of phase two, 2.5 million tons per year, which is coincidentally the amount that they have in their export license for this site. Um, they have more permits right now for liquefaction than is currently in operation in the site. So they could build more without phase two. And so, which seems like adding the storage tank maritime is part of the reason that they want. So if we don't go ahead with maritime LNG, we won't see this expansion, or the case for this expansion will be much reduced, and we might not see that lock-in and this investment in what would become stranded assets. Additionally, of great concern to those local residents was that we will be adding a flare as part of phase two. And so we know now through research that LNG plants flare more than is in the environmental assessments, is in their applications, than is in their plans, particularly in the startup phases. So this is going to be increased pollution, likely breaking permits, in an area that is an urban center. We have other air pollution problems right now that we're doing our best to resolve. This is not going to make them better. This is going to make them worse. And so in terms of impacts, uh, with phase two, we can see the potential for over 100 tanker voyages per year on the Fraser River. And this is not just the Seaspan, Garibaldi, Baker, or Lions, it's the bunkering vessels. The marine jetty application did include tankers of 90,000 meters cubed, which is for export of LNG carriers. Uh, the Fraser is nestled in amongst critical habitat for southern resident killer whales and is an important river for Chinook salmon, their primary prey, that are also struggling, that are also endangered. And so this means if this expansion goes ahead, there will be much more increased traffic along their critical habitat. This means more noise. This means more pollutants. Because of course, vessel traffic does bring pollution, even if nothing goes wrong. It's not just when accidents happen that we have problems for wildlife. The marine jetty does include dredging plans. Air pollution, we've heard it a lot. We'll hear more about it. This will be released all along the supply chain. It's important to note, even if we have reductions immediately in the port area, because the gas is going to come, at least some from fracking, that means that the air pollution will be along the supply chain, will be in the Northeast, and may be displaced, but will not necessarily be reduced. Fugitive emissions are a known issue. They're called fugitive for a reason. They're difficult to abate. And of course, greenhouse gases. With the Montney play, this was identified as a carbon bomb that needs to be kept in the ground if we are, as humans, to prevent the worst of runaway climate change. It is a globally significant source of emissions that would be best left underground and not released. It's also notable that in BC, we had a requirement that LNG expansion in terminals like this be electrified. And that requirement has been reduced. It's been loosened. And so our claims to being a climate leader, even in the province of British Columbia, are being undermined by our own policies. Um, And so I'll leave it there. This was the follow-up to the walking tours, a picnic. And you can't see it because of the fog, because it was a beautiful July Pacific Northwest day when we had this picnic. But this is a park that's a popular picnic spot where there is an active fishing community that we will have tankers go by if this expansion goes through, that the Seaspan Garibaldi already navigates by. And so there will be increased impacts from that of no, underwater noise, air pollution, and also just disturbances. Uh, so I'll leave it there. Back to you, Gabby.
You, Anna. Does anyone have any questions that we should address live? Just also as a reminder, we will have a dedicated Q&A section at the end of the presentations. Um, and then also for panelists, please put your, if you have any questions that you can answer, you can also answer them in the Q&A box as the presentations are happening. But I see Vi, that you have a question. Um, if it's pertinent to the last presentation, we can answer it now. But I'll give you the floor. If you want to ask your question, you should be able to unmute yourself. Okay, if not, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, no, that was not intentional. No question.
All good. Okay. Okay, I'll pass it off now to Stacy to talk about some of the impacts in Washington.
Thanks, Gabby. And thanks for the great presentation so far. I just want to touch on a little bit different sides of what's going on and sometimes things that are left out of this discussion when we start talking about the environmental impacts, a little bit tangentially of those health impacts. I appreciate it, Anna, you bringing in those pictures to remind us that there's communities around all of these things. And I think a main point that I want to make is that the history of tomorrow is being made today. And a lot of people tend to think and picture that land theft and forced resource extraction of indigenous peoples, that's history that happened a long time ago. But frankly, it's continuing to happen through both the legal system and violent acts of law enforcement agencies. So I just want to touch on a few examples that happened pretty recently. And in a lot of these cases, there's still ongoing legal issues literally happening today. Here in Washington, a lot of us are aware of Puget Sound Energy wanting to build a fracked gas refinery, and the Puyallup tribe leading resistance that started around 2017. So again, not very long ago. That took several years. Although it's for oil, not gas, the Standing Rock resistance against the Dakota Access Pipeline that was happening very widely in 2016. And then also in 2019, the Coastal GasLink pipeline in British Columbia that was violating the Wet'suwet'en people's unceded territory. So I know a lot of the gas coming down for Seattle's cruise ships is supposed to be coming from BC. So when we think about that, this is very directly connected to what's happening up there. And all of these things, when we look at that, what does this really mean to do this work of taking these resources from these places? It means violations of sovereignty. It means exposure to the dangers of man camps. It means loss of habitat for wildlife and the peoples connected to those food sources. It means contaminated water. It means damage or lack of access to sacred sites. And of course, all of the health impacts, like was already discussed earlier today. We have to be talking about these things also and kind of bringing these into the costs along with climate impacts and some of the health harming emissions just right around where they're burned. Where they're extracted is also being extremely impacted. When I said that these things are still happening through violence, again, if you're not following these fights, you might not be aware. In the case of the Wet'suwet'en in BC, there was memos that said, go ahead and use lethal force to make these people that are just standing on their own land leave. They were given a green light to shoot people, to make them leave for this gas. In Standing Rock, all of the forced removal to clear camp was, burning of things that were built, all of the guns that were there, even in Tacoma against the Puget Sound Energy. Um, we see riot police lined up, against people standing on the side of roads praying. And if these aren't things that you've seen, I really encourage you to look them up so that these things um, can sit in your heart when you're talking and thinking about this. And I just like to note another way to do that is I noticed that Darren and Benita Moore are here with us in the audience today, and they're the documentary filmmakers of Ancestral Waters, which was on the ground footage of that Tacoma LNG fight. And encourage people to watch that documentary. Especially, it looks like I saw at least one port commissioner and people who work on the port here. Um, those those same facilities also tend to have violations once they're built. Puget Sound Energy has violated the clean air emissions at least 17 times that that I've seen on record. So that's releases of those health harming gases. The Coastal GasLink pipeline in BC already has environmental violations on records. And one other perspective that I just really want to bring to this, and it partially, at least for myself, answers one of the other questions that have been brought up in the Q&A of, if you're against this, then what are you for? And one thing I just want to bring up that is almost always left out when we talk about alternative or sustainable fuels is that along with transitioning to better energy sources, we need to be looking for ways to drive down demand. And that keeps being left out of the conversation. Both global shipping and the cruise industry are constantly growing. They're praising the increases as good for the economy. But we as humans are using too many of Earth's resources every year. If you've heard of Earth Overshoot Day, it keeps getting earlier and earlier every year. We are taking all of the resources from our children and grandchildren. And we can't keep just framing conversation around switching one fuel to another while expanding or continuing business as usual. We are collectively not being good ancestors. And as I said, the history of tomorrow is happening today. So if we continue to push that off and not try to answer that question of how we draw back our use of resources, who is going to do it? And is it going to be too late by the time there are people ready to do that? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacey, for sharing that perspective. I'm now gonna switch again to presentation. Um, and since we talked a lot about some of the drawbacks of these methane-based fuels, I also wanted to talk about what other alternatives are out there. Specifically today, touching on e-methanol and e-ammonia, also called green methanol or green ammonia. And this in and of itself could be a hour-long presentation. So this is going to be a pretty quick overview, keeping it high level. So both green methanol and green ammonia are classified as e-fuels, also called synthetic fuels, where their production is driven by renewable electricity. The foundational component of e-fuels is green hydrogen, which is hydrogen extracted from water via a process called electrolysis, when electricity is used to split up water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. And this would take place in a machine called an electrolyzer. To be considered green, the electrolyzer would need to be powered by renewable electricity. That hydrogen is then combined with other inputs to produce various e-fuels. Normally or for a lot of e-fuels, that would be carbon dioxide. In the case of ammonia, that would be nitrogen. So in essence, this process converts electricity into liquid or gaseous fuels that would have greater energy density and storage capability than batteries, which is necessary to decarbonize energy-intensive industries like deep-sea shipping. So looking at methanol is a liquid alcohol that's used to produce various products like plastics, paints, and fuel, with applications for maritime shipping. Green methanol, also called e-methanol, is produced by combining green hydrogen with carbon dioxide. Currently, there are 147 methanol-fueled large ships on the water and 290 on the order books, as well as hundreds more methanol-capable ships on the water or on order, meaning these ships are equipped to be able to run on methanol in the future. Methanol bunkering is already happening or being explored at ports around the world. And this includes in Washington. So, as part of the EPA Clean Ports Program Grant Award, the Northwest Seaport Alliance, Port of Seattle, Port of Tacoma, Washington Maritime Blue, and American Bureau of Shipping are exploring bringing methanol to service ships in the Gateway. And these partners are actively working on a bunkering pilot project that's planned for September of this year. These ports are also have green shipping corridor agreements that will explore methanol shipping. This includes a cruise green shipping corridor that goes up to Alaska from Seattle and corridor projects with the Republic of Korea. Some of the advantages of methanol is that the carbon dioxide used to make green methanol, if it is sourced sustainably, makes the fuel net zero or close to net zero. Green methanol is also a liquid at room temperature, which makes it easier to store and handle. It's water soluble, does not bioaccumulate, and biodegrades quickly, which reduces its risk to the marine environment. And the already many operational methanol-fueled ships and methanol bunkering projects demonstrate the safe handling of methanol for the maritime industry. However, as Enzo talked about when he was talking about e-methane, this type of e-fuel does require an input of captured carbon, and so that sustainability will vary widely depending on its source. You would need direct air capture for net neutrality, which is still a pretty nascent technology and is not at scale. There's also some NOx emissions associated with methanol, although there are technologies to help reduce those emissions. Looking at ammonia, it is a carbon-free e-fuel. Its formula is NH3. It combines hydrogen with nitrogen, which is found abundantly in the air, and it is largely used currently in the agricultural industry to make fertilizer. It exists as a gas at room temperature, but it can be cooled to a liquid for applications in the maritime industry. Some of its advantages as a carbon-free fuel, ammonia has significant potential for carbon emissions reductions. And though it's less mature than green methanol, there are hundreds of ammonia-ready vessels on the water or on the order books. Also, since since nitrogen is found abundant in the air, it's simpler, potentially less expensive to create green ammonia, has less of those scalability constraints for the e-fuels that require input of captured carbon. The cheaper, easier to make is not necessarily true at the moment just because of economies of scale, but it doesn't have that constraint in terms of the necessary inputs required to create ammonia. Some of its disadvantages, there are still emissions from ammonia that need to be addressed. Combustion can create various NOx emissions that are harmful to health and cause acid rain. Can also create nitrous oxide, which is a powerful greenhouse gas with a warming potential that's 273 times greater than carbon dioxide. So that particular emission would definitely need to be addressed, so it doesn't undermine any of the climate benefits of ammonia. There's also emissions from the pilot fuels that's needed to ignite these fuels, both ammonia and methanol, although they are pretty negligible compared to traditional fossil fuels. Unburned ammonia can also escape through the exhaust and contribute to the formation of particulate matter. There's also some safety risks associated with ammonia. It is highly toxic, both to humans and the marine environment. There can be greater challenges with ammonia in storage and transportation due to its corrosiveness to various materials. These challenges can be managed and mitigated, but will require strict monitoring and regulatory oversight, robust health and safety protocols, innovations in technologies to reduce these emissions, and comprehensive rules and regulations that manage ammonia's potential risks. Looking across these e-fuels, one of its biggest challenges is getting the production to scale for use in the maritime shipping industry. At this time, the vast majority of methanol and ammonia produced worldwide are made with fossil fuels. So, to produce the green hydrogen that's needed for e-fuels, we need much more renewable energy and more electrolyzer manufacturing. The different e-fuels might also require new infrastructure for transportation and distribution, including bunkering for ships. There may be opportunities to retrofit or repurpose existing infrastructure, but that interoperability with these new e-fuels will vary. Meeting this infrastructure build out requires coordination of policy at the local and state level and public-private partnerships to finance and build this infrastructure. And again, each of these new fuels will require comprehensive rules and regulations to address any issue of toxicity, environmental impact, material compatibility, potential emissions, bunkering procedures, and safe fuel storage. Additionally, the maritime industry needs new requirements, protocols, and workforce training for safe handling and emergency response. And finally, I want to emphasize that e-fuels are not energy efficient to make. Energy is lost through electrolysis to produce hydrogen, to capture the carbon dioxide in the case of carbon-based e-fuels, in the synthesis to combine the hydrogen with the other inputs, and in the distribution of these fuels, and finally in their combustion. This energy inefficiency is why it's important to first apply direct electrification where feasible. So this applies to shore power for ships at berth and electrification of small hovercraft and other short route ships, and to pursue efficiency measures and technologies to reduce fuel consumption, such as advanced sails. So just to wrap up this discussion, this is the last presentation in this panel discussion. Speaking for Pacific Environment, we do recognize how critical a role ports and shipping play in the local and regional economy, employing thousands of workers and moving the goods that we use every day. Beyond efficiency measures and electrification where feasible, e-fuels will be necessary to decarbonize shipping and reduce the pollution burden on nearby communities. We raise these challenges and drawbacks of these various fuels because we need a complete and comprehensive picture to prioritize investments in the solutions with the greatest promise for emissions reductions and proactively build in the safeguards to minimize and mitigate their potential harms, and make sure that we're not investing in false solutions. We recognize that Washington is already starting to address these challenges through initiatives like the Sustainable Maritime Fuels Collaborative. Yet meeting this challenge will require still broadening the conversation with all affected stakeholders, including community members, to proactively understand and respond to any health and safety concerns and rectify the ongoing environmental injustices portside communities have long suffered from their disproportionate exposure to industrial pollution, as well as like the expansion of infrastructure, as Stacy spoke about. So that is it for the presentation part of this discussion, but we want to hear from all of you. So feel free to raise your hand or drop any questions in the Q&A box if you have any at this time.
And maybe we can ask the panelists to come back on video if you are able and feel comfortable. And I'm gonna re-raise this question because I think really I'm sure it's on the mind of most everyone here. So we had a question in the Q&A box, and I'll read it out. And I've started answering it, and Enzo has too, but I'm just gonna see if other panelists wanted to chime in, or anyone else really, any other participants. The question is, I'm hearing your concerns about methane. Assuming methane slip cannot be reduced to acceptable levels, what are the future maritime fuels that you could support? In the interim, would you prefer continued use of conventional maritime fuels while those alternatives are further developed? And I have said my piece already, so I'm gonna open it up to other people, or Enzo, if you wanted to vocalize your response as well.
Yeah, I can get the ball rolling. I mean, I put the answer in chat and I can read it out mostly as is. So my answer is very similar to what Fern wrote in the chat, in that for Marbim, we see identifying a very specific winner now as kind of premature. And we place priority on the decision frameworks and capturing all the known impacts and avoiding that this next round upcoming of capital and infrastructure is locking the sector into decades of methane use and stranded assets. Because infrastructure deployed today will last 20, 30, 50 years, which is decades beyond when shipping has agreed to be net zero, and these are guaranteed, therefore, to be stranded assets. Now, in the interim, our priority is indeed on supporting efficiency measures. So, some examples here I wrote: wind assistance, hull coatings, speed reductions that don't suffer from these trade-offs that methane-based fuels have. And most importantly, these are not stranded assets. Once the ship moves to cleaner fuels, you can still use things like wind assistance, hull coatings, especially when e-fuels may be much more expensive and you'll want to save them even more. And these are unlike investments into methane-based fuels, which are guaranteed to be sunk. And I guess to summarize, we're not saying do nothing now. We're saying that there are a lot of measures that you can do to reduce, at the same time, GHG emissions, pollutants, and biodiversity threats, rather than focusing on just one and leaving the other two to suffer.
Yeah, I'll hop in to echo what has been said already of investing in efficiency is something, and reduction of fuel use is something that is going to be positive regardless of fuel choice, and does not lock us in. And it touches on one of the things that Stacy called for of demand reduction. One of the things that we've seen come into the Port of Vancouver is I've literally seen ships with wind assistance on board. And so, it's possible. There's technology that exists that can be retrofitted. And one of the other issues that we have with biodiversity problems is routing. And so we have an overflow of anchorages around the Port of Vancouver. And if we could get more efficient about routing and about collaboration and coordination on shipments coming, both from the land side as well as from the water side, we could have massive reductions in the impact, particularly locally when you consider something like anchor chains and the impact in the Gulf Islands of reducing, and that has cascading effects also for fuel usage. And so as we can collaborate more and look at efficiency, then we have cascading impacts on fuel use as well. And so I would echo what's been said and also say that there's a behavior element and how the shipping industry organizes it that is also helpful.
Great.
Did you have anything else to add on that point, Fern?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we often hear also clearly, with the more recent lack of regulation at the global level, at the IMO, that has created uncertainties. And I think this is like where really ports and industry has a role, and not really only a role, but a duty to take on that leadership. Because, I mean, we hear this about like, oh, we need regulation to provide uncertainty, but you are the actors. You're the main actors, the decision makers in all of these, like making major investment decisions. So I really feel like this is really a time for for ports and the shipping industry to really step up and um, yeah, be the leader that you all are. So um, there are but before we move on from this question, does anyone else have any other sort of questions, comments? We did want to have this not just as a Q&A, but like really a discussion, which is why we left the chat open. People can feel free to come off mute and provide comments, even if you don't have questions. So I'm gonna hang on here for a bit before we move to other questions.
Yeah, it looks like Logan has a question. So, Logan, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for your presentations. Yeah, I guess to Fern's point, I kind of wanted to hop in here and spitball some things based on what everyone was talking about, particularly what Enzo was talking about with stranded assets. It's kind of a convoluted follow through here, but broadly speaking, I'm wondering what opportunities there are for industry to pivot that infrastructure in the event that regulations on shipping kind of take root and start moving away. What outlets would LNG manufacturers or distributors have? Particularly, I'm thinking about how frequently I'm hearing about data centers proposing these on-site energy generation projects, and the role that LNG plays in our electrical grid over the past 20 years, the increasing share that that's taken. And to Stacy's point, kind of facilitating an ever increasing energy demand right as all of these alternatives are improving in efficiency and could really offer us some offloading of some of these carbon emissions. And now, broadly speaking, society has found an infinite sink for energy and AI use. And I'm just curious kind of what everyone else is thinking about that. Thank you.
Would anyone care to?
I will get Enzo got us rolling on the last question, so I will get us rolling on this one. And what I will say is that ultimately, my perspective is that we share one atmosphere on this planet and that we need to take care of it. We have to take care of the planet so that we can continue to live here. The ocean is a particular ecosystem and that it's like all kind of touching itself. Pollution does not know borders, it knows currents. And so as as we increase noise or increase pollution, that doesn't just affect us. It affects all of us. And so while we as humans may think that what we can do with our brain powers and with technology is all the things that we can do, we do have to also consider that we have one planet, and that planet has one atmosphere, and so we need to take care of it. And we know the science is very clear about the need to reduce greenhouse gases for us to be able, for us to have the best shot at living most kindly on this planet with each other and with wildlife. And so I will start the ball rolling there. That while there may not be a limit on what we can do, there are limits on how much more we can pollute. And so we have to be cognizant of reducing pollution, whether that's greenhouse gases or criteria air contaminants or discharges into water.
Thanks, Anna. I'm gonna maybe read out another question. I'll come back to Steve's question, Steve Nicholas's question as well. But here we have a question from Melissa Parks for Enzo. Can you talk more about ways to measure methane slip emissions that ship owners could adopt and that policymakers could consider? If we can't measure, we don't really know how to target it. Agree on that.
Yeah, thanks for this question. And I want to preface this by saying I'm definitely not an expert in this. And I've been talking a lot to the researchers. There's a group at ICCT who have been doing a lot of research into measuring real world methane slip emissions. And if you would like to, I'm happy to put anyone in contact with them or forward any questions directly to them. But from what I understand, methane slip, or particularly on board, is not a rocket science to measure. It's not like it comes out of 1,000 different places. The methane slip is coming straight out of the exhaust of these engines. Um, what is slightly challenging is measuring the difference between main engine methane emissions and auxiliary engine methane emissions. And if you're not a ship owner, if you're doing independent measurement, say using drone technology, um, you're not able to know exactly what fuel they're using at what moment and their engine loads and so to speak. So the correlation is really hard. But essentially, the technologies involved, you can use sort of remote detection. I showed that image of someone taking like a infrared, is just a, I think it's an infrared camera with a filter on it. Um, we can do satellite detection using drones to either detect the plumes themselves or to do infrared imaging. That is very useful in port facilities, for instance, where you could directly, like a port itself, could use this technology to measure methane emissions that are occurring in its own port. Um, and of course, tailpipe readings are the most important. So ship owners are the only ones who can really install that on their own ships, but they could be mandated to or required to install some sort of methane monitoring technology um, on their exhausts. I don't know if anybody else, any other speakers would like to add on to that.
I'll pop on to say, and so you sound like an expert to me. I will add a sort of yes, we can't measure, we don't really know how to target, but we can learn from each other. We don't need to measure every single engine. We know that low loads are problematic for methane slip. There's higher methane slip at low loads. And so we also know that, okay, that's something that we can take action on and say, okay, if it's an auxiliary engine, that may be something that is easier to electrify in our case because it's dealing with those low loads. And so I think that that is a thing, we don't need to measure every single ship. We can, especially if we share information. And so that would be the only thing that I would add on to what Enzo said, is I think he nailed it, is that one thing that we can add is sharing information and making sure that we're communicating on this. If we go together, we can go far. If you go alone, you can go fast. But if we go together, we can go far. And that collective action is going to be what makes a big difference for the maritime industry and for the atmosphere.
Nice. Thank you. Um, and I think there's some of the resources linked in the slides which will make publicly available as well. But we can also add a little more resources of what Enzo talked about. Yeah, and there are other organizations beyond ICCT also who do methane monitoring. Okay. Um, So there's a new question, but we still have like 9 more minutes. So I'm gonna go to this earlier question from Steve Nicholas. How many years, decades do you estimate it will take for e-methanol and or e-ammonia to reach the scale of development and deployment to be a viable maritime fuel option? Do you believe we should stick with the conventional fuels versus using LNG, RNG, e-LNG as an interim solution? And in the meantime, and thereby forego the significant local air quality and environmental justice benefits of those LNG, RNG, and e-LNG? And I can take a first crack at that. And in a way, I think I push back on the premise of the question because really we're not talking about continuing to use just conventional fuels versus switching to LNG and other methane-based fuels. I think Enzo and I sort of started to answer this question already in that what we're saying is don't switch to LNG and switch to other efficiency measures, which reduces the amount of conventional fuels used. Because even when you switch to LNG, it's not an entire switch. The majority of what we're seeing are dual fuel ships. It's dual fuel conventional and LNG. So, I feel like we're not, and we are saying reduce fuel use overall, not just use the same amount but switch to LNG, which I think that's kind of like the assumption within that question. So that would be my answer. And of course, like and I'll speak for other organizations here too, we definitely do not want to forego the local air quality improvements impacts, which is especially important when ships are docked in port. And that's why we really see a plethora of other clean technologies, including shore power, being part of the solution package. And with shore power, you're not burning any fuel at all, even if it's LNG. So, any on the number of years, I'll have to get back to you on that because I can't remember from the top of my head. Other panelists might know, but that is something that I know we have in the literature that we've reviewed, and also the IMO.
I won't be shy. I'll hop in to say two things. One is in terms of number of years, we're talking about innovation and innovation cycles, and those are kind of market investment dependent. So we have our best guesses, and also if we decide to do this, then we can do it better, faster, and that is a possibility. The second thing I'll say is that there are trade-offs with any change. And so if there are local air, we need to consider the life cycle of any fuel and any choice that we make. And yeah, if we're using LNG, it may be at least on paper better in the port communities, but it's coming from fracking. And so it's not better as we see in the supply chain. And depending on the time of year, what else is going on in the atmosphere, we could have ground level ozone impacts. And so we could be making smog worse. And so I do think that there is, we want to be careful about the assumptions that we're making and taking a holistic approach, looking at life cycles, looking at trade-offs, and making sure that we're making the best decision that we can from that entire perspective. Because I, as someone who's lived in a port, like, yes, I would love for the air to be cleaner here. I don't want that to come at the cost of someone else's air getting more polluted. Like, that is not an acceptable trade-off to me.
It's great from Anna taking all of my points that I want to say. Just building on that, very similarly with RNG, you have overlooking significant local non-GHG impacts. Similarly, you have trade-offs that the premise of the question slightly ignores. And I think more importantly, we want to push back on as I said earlier, pushing back on this idea that LNG can be an interim solution when we are building infrastructure that is lasting 20, 30, 50 years. 20 years from now is 2046. Shipping by that time has to be clean. This means we're underwriting infrastructure that is going to be stranded way too soon. And there are interesting studies coming out showing that how little of LNG infrastructure can actually be used or reused, redeployed towards sustainable solutions in the future. That I'm happy to share with people.
And in the last few minutes, we have sort of a common question, I think. Um, Given all alternative fuels share the challenges of availability, cost, and health and climate trade-offs, why aren't folks seeking operational changes as the foundation of green corridors? Slow steaming not only reduces emissions, but noise as well. Why not pursue quiet green corridors, which can go into effect quickly? The desired speed needs to be trade specific and not require additional vessels brought into the trade. That's a great point. And I'm not sure if the author of that comment wanted to come online and unmute and say more, or if anyone else would like to respond.
Okay, I will continue my theme of not being shy. I will say quiet corridors would certainly be helpful for wildlife. Southern resident killer whales, one of their problems is prey availability. They sometimes cannot find the fish that is right in front of them because the undersea environment is just too noisy. They use sound to find them. There's too much interference. So this would be incredibly helpful. And there are slowdown programs. Currently, the ECHO program, which is what the Port of Vancouver's is called, is not mandatory. And a couple of different environmental not-for-profits have identified that participation is down year over year. So making it mandatory, expanding it, and even decreasing the speed from what it is now would be helpful for wildlife as well as for fuel use, for safety, and all around. It does require coordination between regulators and the shipping industry. It does require enforcement. And it requires planning and logistics. If a ship does not know about the slowdown zone and then is going to be late to the port tenant, that can have cascading impacts for things on land, like the train schedule or for trucks coming to get or to drop off cargo. So it does require logistics coordination. I do think it's a great idea for humans as well as for our endangered species.
Yeah, and I believe there's also quite sound program that is looking to be expanded, or rather in collaboration with what's called Blue Whale Blue Sky program that is affiliated with NOAA. So that's great in the Puget Sound. But I feel like, I completely agree. And also it's um, again part of like that overall sort of system optimization, right? That we would love to see this as part of the solution as well, not just close to ports, but like in transit. Gabby, I'll hand it back over to you.
Yes, well, since we are at the hour and a half, want to wrap up here. Thank you all so much for attending. As I stated, this is part of this already ongoing conversation that's happening in Washington. We would love to continue to talking with any of the attendees here. We will send a follow-up email with the presentation slides. This webinar is also being recorded, so we can send the recording to you, and would love to keep this conversation going and chat more. So thank you all for participating and being part of this discussion.